It looks like the presentation's coming through there. So excellent. Thanks for having me this morning, everybody. I'm really excited to point out to you the Tennessee Kentucky Plant Atlas and how this is really a resource beyond a lot of the other kind of available plant atlases that you may be more or less familiar. I'm not sure. So I'll start out by giving you a little bit of a background about how these tools got started and really in both of our states. So really in the 1950s, workers in Tennessee, Sharp and Shanks, these are pretty familiar names, I think, to most botanists in the Southern Appalachians. They got started creating an atlas from the herbarium specimens there at the UTK herbarium. And really what they did was they sort of had this stamp and they stamped sort of county outlines of Tennessee on pieces of paper, and then they colored in with pencils and pens, the counties that these species were present. Um, in the 1980s, Chester, Wofford, Krall, DeSelm, and Evans, more familiar names, they went a little bit further and they assembled data from four herbaria in Tennessee, and that's Knoxville, Vanderbilt, Appalachian State, and Memphis at the time. Sort of concurrently, Max Medley began aggregating data for a Kentucky atlas. I'm trying to move hang on just a second, move my window here out of the way. And then in 1999, Gene Wofford and Victor Ma created the first online Tennessee plant atlas. It was really one of the first online plant atlases in the country. And really what they did was they just made graphics, JPEG images of the former photocopied atlas maps. About that same time, Cato Wilbur created an Access database that to my knowledge, wasn't widely shared, but some folks got their hands on it, and it was sort of serving as a Kentucky atlas at the time. So early works for both states were sort of paper-based and photocopied and passed around. Again, the first sort of online atlas for either of our states was Tennessee atlas, and it was mostly it served as a checklist for the state. I provided these atlas maps. If you remember old technology, maybe if you're as gray or nearly as gray as I am these days, you'll remember that familiar paint bucket and how you could sort of just drop it and fill in a polygon. And so that's what they were doing, was just sort of creating these filled in polygons, and they'd save a new image. So if new information came in, they would just add color to a polygon county and then resave the image on the website. Um, and so their website also contains some live images of some of the plant species. So in the early 2000s, then, UT Knoxville, the Tennessee Herbarium Online Atlas, it was progressing cosmetically, but not technologically. In fact, today it still functions under that, it's still available, it still sort of functions under that same framework, kind of old technology, filling in counties and then resaving the images on the website. Um, I'm sure all of you are familiar. It was about 2012. Julian Campbell had taken the atlas that he had been assembling for years and saved it as a PDF. He shared that pretty widely with a lot of us, and then pushed that really PDF online and saving that as Bluegrass Woodland. Around the same time there, in 2010, we started, a whole bunch of us started forming what we named the Southeastern Regional Network of Expertise and Collections, or CERNEC. And we submitted several proposals over a few years to try to get National Science Foundation money to digitize the Southeast's herbaria. And in 2014, CERNEC, we landed a $2.5 million grant from the National Science Foundation. About 50% of those funds went towards the familiar CERNEC portal build that all of us know and use. And about 50% of those funds were spread out among the state leads and were used to mostly hire student labor to do the imaging and sort of skeletal databasing of labeled data. And so At the time, I was the state lead for Tennessee, and Brad Ruffel was the state lead for Kentucky. And really, the two of us had two different strategies. In Tennessee, I traveled around, went to different universities, went to different herbaria, brought imaging stations, trained the faculty and students there on how to do that, and they were doing that work. I think Brad mostly had the other collections that he digitized or oversaw digitization in Kentucky sort of go to Eastern Kentucky where the work was done. Um, so from my part, really from summer 2014 until about summer 2019, I traveled around the state, met with a lot of the other herbarium curators. There were 12 herbaria in Tennessee, 200 students trained, 2,500 hours, 30 faculty and staff. And in summer 2019, we completed digitizing in Tennessee. And I'm pretty sure about that same time, Brad was wrapping up digitizing in Kentucky. So I'll go through each of the states here independently. So the total number of vascular plant species in Tennessee herbaria was really kind of, when you think about it, it's the first time that we were able to get actual counts and not sort of estimates. There are 13 herbaria in Tennessee, and these, I'm not going to read these numbers, but you see the numbers of specimens that we digitized at each of those collections. And so over those 4 years, we digitized about 730,000 specimens from Tennessee and pushed those data to CERNEC. As I was sort of finishing up that project, I started reaching out to the Tennessee Native Plant Society to ask them if they would be interested in funding a new atlas built on new technology. That should say September 2019. And I was asking them to sort of support that, and they did to a tune of $20,000 to get us going. So we started working. I was working on the atlas for about a year when Brad Ruffel reached out to me, and Tara Littlefield was on that conversation. And Brad, Tara, and I, at first we were talking about, they were talking to me about how could they get started on a Kentucky atlas similar to Tennessee's. And after a little bit of a discussion, we decided to sort of join forces and make a joint two-state atlas. When we look at the total number of vascular plant specimens in Kentucky herbaria, it's a little bit more confused because there have been sort of the collapse of several more collections in Kentucky than there have been in Tennessee to this point. And so you can see some lines there where I've traced where some of these collections went through time. But in the end, there were these four collections that you see in blue that were the collections digitized that were overseen by Brad and his work. I think it's really cool that Quinn got funding to finally digitize University of Kentucky specimens. I think all of you know about the how those specimens were poisoned, and CERNEC couldn't handle doing that because we needed additional sort of work to take care of that and to do it safely. So those were skipped by CERNEC, but Quinn is working to fill in data gaps. So when Tara, Brad, and I got together to talk about a combined atlas, we thought, it made sense for a lot of reasons. And one reason is that there are many shared ecoregions between our two states. A second reason is that Tennessee herbaria actually holds significant numbers of specimens from Kentucky. And so when you look at the number of sort of specimens, the first column you see there, vascular plant specimens, that's how many specimens were digitized from those respective collections. The column next to that, Tennessee specimens, is how many of those specimens were from the political boundary of Tennessee. And so that you can see, for example, in Tennessee herbaria, there are 306,000 specimens. In Kentucky herbaria, there are 5,701 specimens of Tennessee collected plants, right? So when you look at Kentucky herbaria hold about 58,000 specimens, or at least at the time, 58,000 specimens of Kentucky collected plants. Or I'm sorry, Tennessee herbaria held 58,000 specimens of Kentucky collected plants, and Kentucky herbaria held 160,000 specimens of Kentucky collected plants. So when you think about that, there's a significant number of Kentucky collected specimens held in Tennessee herbaria. Again, another reason that a combined atlas makes sense. The third reason is that our floras are really similar. One of the things that I was looking at behind the scenes was what is the flora of Tennessee, what is the flora of Kentucky, and it turns out that Kentucky has about 300 vascular plant species that Tennessee does not. Tennessee has more than that number than Kentucky has, largely the Central Basin endemics. And so again, the floras overlap, the ecoregions overlap, and the collections in our herbaria overlap. So it makes a lot of sense to have a two-state atlas. Um, the other thing I want to tell you about is sort of independent of the atlas and specimen digitization at the time. Dwayne Estes and I had been tinkering with a database of the plants of Tennessee and sort of filling in this database for all of these kinds of characters. And once we got close to thinking about a two-state atlas, I added those about 300 species for Kentucky into this sort of Excel spreadsheet. And through the years, we've been keystroking in all kinds of data. And so this spreadsheet contains information, taxonomic information you can see in sort of the first window, right? Scientific name and common names and those sorts of things. The second little figure there shows conservation metrics. Is it on a invasive plant list or is it a state listed species and those sorts of things? And then we've got general ecological characters, stem and leaf characters, so kind of vegetative or morphological. There are phenological and reproductive characters, community system and habit distribution characteristics. And so when you think about this list of species, about 4,000 or 5,000 species long between our two states, we've got about 200 characters here. We're talking about a spreadsheet of about 1 million cells of data. And this is something that Estes and I started, and since he's been so busy with SGI the last 5 or 8 years or so, it's something I've been trying to carry on. So we had this spreadsheet, and so the first Tennessee Kentucky Plant Atlas was released in 2019. There are a few subsequent editions with small fixes here and there. In spring of 22, I started working on the second edition of the Guide to the Vascular Plants of Tennessee. I refined the keys, I updated the nomenclature and species concepts. I reconciled just about every species with Weekly. I don't always agree with names that he's using or reasons that those are there, and I've tried to explain that. And so the Guide to the Vascular Plants of Tennessee, the second edition, is in press now, and we expect it to be out in book form in fall of 26. But the Tennessee Kentucky website and this database Excel spreadsheet companion sort of align with the guide, and the website and the database contain the most current information. Another thing I want to note really quickly is that because we had a two-state updated checklist that I had sort of refined or reconciled with Weekly, Seven Brothers, one of my former graduate students, and I worked to assign coefficients of conservatism or C values to the two-state flora. Tara was a major contributor to that, as well as several others on this conference. And so that paper is in press. It should be out in Castania in the next edition or so. So these coefficients of conservatism are also on the newest version of the Tennessee Kentucky Plant Atlas. So version 7.1 was released this past October, and it's had massive updates. The website itself, the landing page, when you go there, looks just like this. It shows the number of species that we cover, the number of non-native species, the number of native species. We actually have 23,000 live plant images. You'll see some examples of those. We cover a total of 5,158 species for the two states, and there are 401,000 herbarium specimens supporting the atlas or the species distributions of every species. All right. And then behind the scenes, connected to this website is that spreadsheet, that database I was telling you about. That is um, really 5,045 species rows, 250 columns of data, names, species names, nativity, conservation metrics, including those C values, morphological characters, habitat characters, soil characters, again, about a million data cells. It's not 100% complete. It's probably only 65% complete. I, I'm working on it a little bit every week. So the next thing I want to do is sort of orient you all to the atlas. On the landing page, there are these quick, you can do a quick species search in two different places. It's a little bit redundant, but some people like the bar at the top and other people like to go to that little place at the bottom left. But you can go in there and you can keystroke in a species name and it'll take you to the species page. And the information that you see there on the species page, there's quite a bit of it. It starts out in the top left with information on classification. And you can see the C value there. There's plant notes, which I don't have any for this species. And then you can see underneath that characteristics. Is this species armed? No. So this is information that's being harvested from that spreadsheet, that database behind the scenes, right? What is the leaf margin of the species? Is it entire? And so on and so forth. To the right, you see live plant images, and to the right of that, you can see the atlas distribution for our two states. Underneath that atlas distribution is a table of the herbarium specimens actually responsible for generating that. So if you see a county that doesn't seem right to you, you can go look that up, click the link, and look at the specimen to verify whether or not you think it's correctly identified. The live pictures that you see to the right, if you click on the view more photos there, you'll pull up these live images. And one of the things that I've tried to do is to curate these images so that they actually show taxonomically important characters to those species. In other words, characters that will align with the keys. Oh, I forgot I had squares around some of these things to talk about. So here you can see, again, the sort of the landing page. The next thing I want to point out is this advanced species search, and it's maybe the strongest feature of the website. If you go to the advanced species search, you can actually click to harvest data or to refine the data that the website pulls to you based on that spreadsheet. So you can do searches for a native shrub with opposite leaves. Right? You can do searches of all kinds of different things, native species, whether it's got some endemism tied to it. You can pull lists of species with certain C values. You could generate a query for what are the species from Adair County that are woody with alternate leaves and milky sap and armored. Right? So there's all kinds of information that you can use to pull this. And so, for example, here you can see advanced search that I did looking for species from Adair County that are ferns and yeah, the ferns from Adair County, if that's what you're interested in, right? Here's another search that I did, Adair, Allen, and Anderson counties, looking for plants with alternate leaves, and it generates that list and gives you those specimens. And so it's an incredibly powerful tool. Hopefully it'll be useful to a lot of folks. And as with a lot of these things, it's a work in progress. And every week, every month, it'll get a little bit better. But I think it's pretty functional at this point. Thanks for having me, and I'm happy to address questions as they might arise.